So I start off that I'm not representing the U.S. government or the U.S. Army Research Laboratory. I'm here as a private citizen only. Have to get that out of the way. I'm sometimes asked if I'm in the Army. And no, I'm not. I'm a civilian employee of the Army, and I work at the Army Research Laboratory. And then I'm very often asked, what in the world is the Army doing with tech? And it turns out the Army Research Laboratory is full of scientists writing journal papers and reports and other documents, normally with significant technical and mathematical content. So it's kind of, to me, it's kind of obvious why anyone might be interested in tech. So I also read the instructions for preparing a talk and doing it right. So I'm going to tell you about where I first learned about computers, Knuth, and tech, what I knew about word processing, how I first came to use tech, how the early years played out, the fact that the middle years were qualitatively different, and indeed recent events have continued that evolution. So, I first experienced computers in 1970. A high school friend of mine came to me and said, you know, at MIT on Saturdays, they have this thing where the high school students can come in and learn all sorts of neat stuff. You want to go? Sounded like a good idea to me. And so for the next 3 years, every spring I went into MIT on Saturdays. And so while there, one of the things I learned was about computers. And in fact, I learned quite a bit about the IBM 1130 computer and Fortran programming and the 026 and 029 card punches. It was a very interesting experience. And so I think I learned a little bit different flavor of computers than a lot of folks in the early 70s. I then went off to college where, because I was indecisive, I majored in physics and math. I had friends in the physics department that had a vision that computers were really, really important, and so they double majored in physics and computer science. And during some of the many conversations you have as freshmen in college, they told me, oh yes, we learned that you really only need to know everything that's in this one set of books, The Art of Computer Programming by Don Knuth. I said, well, that sounds like a pretty good set of books, and actually, gosh, that would be an easy field to be in. You only have to know what's in these 3 books. But I didn't change majors. So as an undergraduate, the physics had HP 2100 mini computers. The engineering department had PDP-8s. And the university had an IBM 360. So I still learned how to type on teletypes and punch cards and do all sorts of interesting things. And then I went off to graduate school. By then I decided I was going to be a physicist. And I went to the University of Missouri at Rolla. And in the mid-70s, UMR was, I think, the only U.S. engineering school without a VAX computer. It was pure data general all the way. Also, lots of IBM mainframe, time-sharing terminals, all that sort of stuff. Another thing that happened while I was in graduate school, in Scientific American, Douglas Hofstadter had a little article, Variations on a Theme as the Essence of Imagination. It was all about Don Knuth and Metafont and tech typesettings. Oh, I remember that guy. Back when I was an undergraduate, my friends told me all about him. Well, that's interesting. And sometime even later, I was browsing through the college bookstore, as one is wont to do, and going through the computer section, and there was this blue spiral-bound book, the tech book. And I said to myself again, I remember that guy. Oh, I remember this was what that article was about. Well, this is very interesting. So I bought the book and read it. And let me assure you, it's much easier to read the tech book if you don't have a tech installation where you can try these things out and get trapped. So, one thing you do as a graduate student is you have to write some papers and a thesis. And in these days, a thesis would be typewritten by a professional typist that you gave money per page to. And when the typist had typed it up, you would go back to your advisor and they'd mark it all up and have things to change, and you'd have to pay to have it typed all over again. And the reason you had to pay to have it typed, because the only way you could do it right was if the typist had an IBM Selectric typewriter with interchangeable balls so they could put the math in. And while there were such typewriters scattered around the university, they did not like the students, even graduate students, to get their fingers on them and mess them up. So, again, in the early 80s, microcomputers were coming along, and one of them was the Motorola 6809. And we had a couple of professors that were convinced these were really wonderful things. And one of them actually must have had a half a dozen in his lab, and a couple of them were set up to daisy wheel printers, and you could type on the little screen, and the daisy wheel printer would go, and it would stop when it was time to change the wheels, and you change the wheel, it would print a character, and you put the right wheel back in, and it would go on. At the same time, on the IBM mainframe, there was this thing we discovered. I'm not sure how we did it. There was some article in the computer science department's or computer department's little newsletter that came out. They had put in something called IBM General Markup Language that could talk to this 240 dot per inch laser printer. My advisor and I actually beat our heads against the wall and got one journal submission through that processing chain and submitted it to a journal. Of course, because we'd spent all our time trying to get the math to line up, they were not terribly impressed by the science behind what we were doing. And so we retyped it on another system and improved it and sent it off to another journal. In addition to the campus computers, we also used the computers at the Department of Energy's Magnetic Fusion Energy Computer Center. And we started out on the 7600, and before you know it, they had a Cray, and reading the messages of the day coming through there, someone announced that they had tech compiled and running, and they were going to run a huge metafont job and generate all the fonts that everyone needed. Well, we were not about to get back into that game, but IBM PCs had come along, and some people were using WordStar, and we saw this other thing called Volkswriter, and Volkswriter was really neat because it had a simple way that you could define a half a dozen bitmapped characters to use in your document for those characters that your printer didn't know anything about. And so that's what I eventually wrote my thesis on, using a 24-pin dot matrix Toshiba printer. So then I went off to the Army's Atmospheric Sciences Lab, and there it was back to mini computers, HP mini computers. Lots of HP mini computers, lots of VT100 terminals or HP terminals, video terminals, and they even had a VAX in the back. Word processing was done by a technical publications department, and they used some proprietary technical product that I have managed to drive out of my memory, and I no longer know its name, and of course using daisy wheel printers. One of my colleagues was working very hard to get a paper through this system, and he would submit his paper and wait, and they would do their technical and grammar review and print up the copy and say, anything else to change? And it would come back, and he'd go and fix all the math and make it right and send it back, and they'd go and they'd fix the math and send it back, and some other math had broken. So he was very upset and annoyed, and he made a trip to the ballistics research lab for some other reason, and while he was there, he saw some great technical documents, and they told him, oh, that's tech. He said, oh, that looks really nice. He came back and he said, have you ever heard about tech? I said, why, as a matter of fact, I have. Here, read this book. And he went off and he read the book and he said, we've got to get this. So we called his friends back at PRL and they said, oh, you need to get this, blah, 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 blah. He went, okay. He downloaded this software or copied it from an FTP site or whatever and started the process of compiling it and installing it. And about halfway through this process, we looked closer and closer, and we made the discovery that what they had given us was the DVI to LaserJet driver, and that we had not installed tech. But we could print the sample document that was in their distribution. And I think it might have been one of Nelson's projects, actually, that we installed. So back to the guys at BRL, and oh yes, University of Washington. So we've learned about the University of Washington and Pierre McKay, and we ordered the tape, and eventually it came in, and we started reading about what needed to be done. And about that time, I had to go off on a measurements trip, and I went off and tried to measure winds with radars. A couple weeks later, I came back to the lab and went into my office, and there on my desk, a beautiful page of, a very short, beautiful page with some mathematics on it. I said, oh, that's great, yeah. Well, you know, I spent 2 weeks on it, and that only came out of the printer last night. So, in the olden days, it was quite a chore to get tech working and to get anything out. So that's when our real learning started, and that's around the time I joined TUG. So how did I learn? Well, I read the LaTeX source code. As I was doing that, it dawned on me, I don't want to use report.sty. I need to use myreport.sty, and I can start fixing these things, because the default report format was never going to fly with our tech publishing people. So I needed to do a myreport.sty and a myreport10.sty. And then, of course, every time I thought I was close, they said, oh, no, this isn't quite right. And so version 1, 2, 3, 114, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I joined TUG, and so I started getting Tugboat. And it may be difficult for the younger folks to realize, but in those days, every year they printed the contact list of all the TUG members and what computer systems they had tech running on and what output devices they could actually print to. And this was very valuable information, because if you were coming from nowhere, you ended up talking to at least several of these people to figure out how in the world they had done it. So, in addition to that, there was online stuff. There was Comp Text Tech. There was eventually Tech Hacks Digest. And there were TUG conferences. Well, I didn't get organized very fast, and so I missed the 1989 meeting. But I started attending the conferences in 1990 at the Texas A&M meeting. Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but how many people were not at the 1990 meeting at Texas A&M? Raise your hand. Okay. For the rest of you, how many remember the banquet and Bart Childs dressed in the lion suit? See what you folks missed. So, professionally, the original problem was we had a publishing branch that was not responsive to how to use tech to get the job done. But we came to an agreement that if we supplied camera-ready copy, they would accept that and publish the reports. Of course, camera-ready copy meant 300 dot per inch HP laserjet. And we heard some of the problems that that can lead to. The other thing was that in these early days, everything was done with bitmapped fonts. And it was observed wisdom that different printer technologies would spread the ink differently, and hence your metafont parameters needed to be adjusted to get the output to look right, especially with fonts that tended to go spindly like Computer Modern. But of course, Metafont had these parameters built in, and the users shared their results. It says, I got this new printer, and I found that I had to adjust these parameters about like this, and then it looked right. And so these sort of things were also published to keep everyone doing great work. One of the reports I generated documented a software product that produced line printer plots. These were 132 column wide XY maps with density overlays using different letters of the alphabet for different densities. And on the old days with those fancy IBM line printers, that was a great way to get some cheap, fast graphics. Well, when you're trying to show people what the output looks like, and this is before any of us knew what PostScript was or any sensible graphics import technology for tech, I found myself wondering, how am I going to get my line printer simulation into the product? And so I learned enough about Metafont to extrapolate the Computer Modern typewriter typeface into something where in landscape mode I could print a 132 column simulation of line printer output. So there were a few of us that were quite interested in tech, and of course we felt it necessary to spread the word, and some folks just got it. And so there was a small group of folks that said, yeah, this is actually good. That's much better than what we had before. Others only thought they got it. They said, oh, that looks good, I'll try that. And they didn't quite get it. They didn't quite get how markup worked, and they would abuse markup by using 3 levels of nested tags with assorted tweaks in them in order to simulate something that actually should have been done in a completely different way. But eventually their output looked pretty good, and they were very proud of it, but it was very painful to look at the document source. But since we're still generating camera-ready copy, they could go on out. Most people didn't care enough about what the document looked like to spend any time learning how to do it yourself. One of the other things we tried was some literate programming. We had someone that was interested, and he said, well, I need to rewrite this program. What if I try this FWeb? I said, well, it's worth a try. And so he updated the program and documentation using FWeb, and you generate document, generate a Fortran program, compile it, run it, get the answers you want. Well, seems like a good idea. However, most of the rest of the community didn't think that the Fortran source was very well done. Wasn't readable at all. And how are you going to use a program if you can't read the Fortran source? So that never really did catch on. Around this time, we started getting X terminals to use with our Unix system and DVI preview on the X terminal. And wow, was that great. Saved a lot of paper. And finally, we started getting PCs that were powerful enough that we could actually do work on the PC rather than use it as a glorified VT100 or do a toy spreadsheet. So this brings us to PC implementations, and there were, in those days, lots of commercial PC implementations. Lance Carnes' PC Tech, and Richard Kninch's True Tech, and Y&Y Tech, and eventually Scientific Word and Workplace, and of course Blue Sky Research's Textures on the Mac. Every time I saw that, I thought it was the fastest thing on earth. Flash mode was recompiling the document and displaying it between your keystrokes. Very difficult to believe. Oh, and there was also synchronicity. And that all worked because Tech was stable enough that they could hand optimize the assembler routines in the bottlenecks of the inner loops in Tech because they knew that nothing was going to change and they would not have to ever do that again. Then there was MIC-Tech and T-Tech and integrated development editors that knew all about Tech. And then CTAN came along, and that was great. A single, easy-to-use repository. And it even came out on CD every year or two. You didn't even need an internet connection. And finally, there was a laboratory reorganization, and the Army Research Laboratory was created. And BRL, the Ballistics Research Laboratory, who knew an awful lot about computers and had people that would insist that some computing would be done their way, became part of ARL, and the technical publishing people we dealt with were now finally supporting Tech and LaTeX. So more recently, Tech Live has become very important. Every year there's a new Tech Live, and that's important because it keeps us naive users up to date. Throughout this long process, it was not something we ever wanted to do to recompile the working Tech distribution on our Unix machine just because it was now 3.141.5 or just because, oh, there were some errors in the fonts. Back in those days, you had to compile the bitmap fonts for any font you wanted to use. And Metafont was not particularly fast. Didn't have to be. You only ran it once on a font. But when you think of the hundreds of font files that are created from just the Computer Modern family, turns out there was an awful lot of them. And then IDE interfaces like TechShop and TechWorks certainly advanced the ease of use and the discoverability of editing documents for people who had never even seen punch cards or command lines. And it seems these days even a lot of computer programmers live inside their development environment. And learning itself has evolved. Now, when you want to learn how to use LaTeX, there are online courses and manuals. There are people at so many universities that say, hey, you new students, here's what you need to know to get started. There are mailing lists. There's Stack Exchange, in addition to the guy down the hall. So in the old days, we used to read comp text waiting for those brilliant replies. Ah, now I understand. Now there's Stack Exchange, and you get almost, it seems, immediate feedback. And then there's learning about the new stuff. There's the CTAN announce list. There's the Tug homepage where you can go and see what new packages or updated packages have come out. Stack Exchange and Tug conferences, again, new stuff comes out, and it's made available and reported online incredibly fast. So what does the future hold? So other than iTech, what else is coming along? So this week, there's been several or even many examples of software as a service. Versions of tech that work this way have actually been around for a decade, though they were little used and never really caught on. In the past couple of years, smartphones and tablets have made this far more necessary. It's been impossible to get tech on a smartphone until very recently. So if you wanted to use it, you had to go to some web service. The cloud has brought in all of these collaborative tools, shared editing environments, back-ends that can hide all the implementation issues and problems of getting a running system and keeping it up to date. You can read about a new package that you think might solve your problem, try it out on one of these, and it's their job to make sure that it's loaded and so on. Of course, the cloud also brings all of the traditional cloud problems in that the internet drops out and you have nothing. Or a computer you don't even know exists breaks and you can't work. That's the definition of a network. There's a trend to subscribing and having stuff, whatever it is, always available, whether you are using your phone or a computer or a tablet or you're at a kiosk in a store. You just expect that everything of yours is going to be there when you need it, and that you'll be able to manipulate it and use it in what you think are the logical ways. Of course, the people that are supplying the service may use a different logic than you do. So there's also going to be enormous unexpected things happening in the future. And since it's so hard to make predictions, especially about the future, I'm not really going to try. But that's the end of my show, and if anyone actually has any questions that they think I might be able to answer, I guess it's that time.
Questions for Ryan?
Of course. Go ahead, Boris.
Okay. Just, I don't know whether it's a relevant question, but aren't you nostalgic about the times when you could know everything in the tech world? Because right now you can, and I can, and nobody can. Aren't you nostalgic?
It was interesting. I never knew everything in the tech world, but I knew a significant fraction of what a user should know. Now I know a little bit of what a user should know, and I know that there's lots more out there that if I can't solve a problem, I'd better go learn, but at least it's easier to find it and learn about it than it used to be. So, yeah, it used to be you had to read context text in order to simply be a intelligent user.
Additional questions? Barbara?
Not a question, but I would just like to thank Alan for a lovely romp down memory lane.